About 10 years ago, I was camping with my girlfriend in Algonquin Park, Ontario. It wasn't anything extreme, just car camping at one of the established sites. We had a cozy setup, and that night, after a simple dinner, we decided to head down to the shore of a small lake nearby. The air was crisp, and the water was still, reflecting the stars above. It was the perfect evening to relax and unwind. We brought a bottle of wine down with us, sitting by the edge of the lake, enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the occasional call of a loon and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. The peacefulness of the night wrapped around us like a blanket, and we were content just to sit there in silence, soaking it all in. But as we sat there, something broke that silence. A distant, low mechanical hum caught our attention. It wasn't immediately alarming, but it was out of place. The sound was coming from somewhere across the lake, growing louder with each passing second. My girlfriend and I exchanged glances but didn't say a word. We both turned our heads in the direction of the noise, trying to make sense of it. As the noise grew louder, we noticed a bright white light cutting through the darkness. It illuminated the tops of the trees about a kilometer away, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest. The light was moving fast, not directly toward us but in our general direction. It was strange, too fast and too bright for anything we could think of. The mechanical noise, now nearly deafening, drowned out the sounds of the night. My heart began to race as I tried to figure out what was coming. When the light was about 500 meters away, it became clear to me that the noise sounded like a train. The rhythmic clatter and roar were unmistakable, but something wasn't adding up. My mind was struggling to piece it together. Why was there a train in the middle of Algonquin Park? And why was the light so intensely bright, like a beacon cutting through the night? The noise and the light continued to move, passing by us at a distance. We sat there, frozen, our eyes locked on the light as it gradually faded into the distance, taking the thunderous sound with it. The whole event lasted only a minute or two, but it felt much longer. When the light was finally gone, and the noise had faded, we were left in complete silence, the night returning to what it had been before. Neither of us spoke for a while. The stillness of the lake and the darkness around us felt heavier now, as if the peacefulness of the evening had been disturbed by something unnatural. My mind kept trying to rationalize what we had just seen and heard. It was a train, wasn't it? But why? There were no tracks, no reason for a train to be out here in the wilderness. Yet the sound, the light, it had all been so real, so undeniable. The next morning, as we packed up our campsite, the experience from the night before was still gnawing at me. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how I looked at it, the simple fact remained: there were no train tracks in Algonquin Park. There shouldn't have been any train, no matter how real it had seemed. Yet both of us had heard and seen the same thing. It wasn't just in my head. To this day, I have no explanation for what we experienced. It wasn't a trick of the mind, and it wasn't something easily dismissed. It was real, and it happened. But what it was, I still have no idea. The memory lingers, a reminder that sometimes, even in the familiar, the world can present you with mysteries that defy explanation. During the summer of 2019, I was exploring British Columbia in Dora, my trusty Ford Explorer turned camper. I'd spent nearly 3 months on the road, and by late September, the crowds had thinned out. Often, I found myself alone in campgrounds, on trails, and in the backcountry, especially during the week. After camping for a few days in a remote area of Wells Gray Provincial Park, I decided to head towards 100 Mile House before making my way down to Vancouver Island. As the day wore on and the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I felt the fatigue of the road setting in. I spotted a dirt road on my map, leading to a lake, and decided it would be a perfect spot to spend the night. I turned off the main road and drove for about 30 minutes, deeper into the wilderness, until I found the lake. It was peaceful, secluded, and perfect for a quiet evening alone. The sunset was breathtaking. I watched as the sky turned to shades of orange and purple, listening to the distant howls of wolves. I built a small fire to keep warm as the temperature dropped, and poured myself a glass of wine. The solitude was soothing, a comforting blanket of silence wrapping around me. But as darkness settled in, the silence was broken by the low hum of an approaching car engine. It started faint, just a murmur in the distance, but quickly grew louder. Anxiety gripped me, tightening around my chest. In all my time on the road, I had never felt fear like this. I'd driven on treacherous mountain roads, encountered wild animals, and slept alone in the backcountry without issue. But something about the sound of that car unnerved me. I realized with a jolt that this was a dead-end road. The only reason someone would be driving this way was to reach the same secluded spot where I was camped. My heart pounded as my mind raced with irrational thoughts. The image of a sinister figure in a beat-up truck flashed through my mind, the kind of person you'd expect to see in a horror movie, not in real life. I was alone, a woman in her early 30s, parked beside a remote lake with no one knowing where I was. The vehicle grew closer, its headlights cutting through the trees. I sprang into action, running to the back of Dora to grab my axe. I slammed the car doors shut and crouched behind the dark side of the vehicle, away from the light of the fire. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I listened to the car roll up, hoping they'd continue to the other side of the lake and leave me alone. But the car stopped, pulling up right next to Dora on the other side of the fire. Panic surged through me. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden, to not expose myself. But at the same time, I didn't want whoever was out there to find me crouching behind the car with an axe in my hand. I forced myself to act. I threw open the driver's door and slammed it shut as hard as I could, hoping to make it sound like I was anything but afraid. The door of the other vehicle slammed shut in response, followed by the roar of an engine starting up. I peeked around the side of Dora just in time to see the car's taillights receding into the darkness, heading to the far end of the lake. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I quickly doused my fire and scrambled into the back of my car, locking the doors behind me. I lay there in the darkness, every sound outside amplified, my mind refusing to settle. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but it wasn't restful. I was jolted awake by a terrifying nightmare, a pair of dirty hands pushing a pillow down on my face. The panic I felt was so real. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing as if I had truly been fighting for my life. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up and left, not bothering to eat or even make coffee. I drove out of there as fast as I could, the weight of the previous night's events heavy on my mind. To this day, I don't know who it was that pulled up beside me that night. Maybe they were just another camper looking for a spot to spend the night, or maybe they were just as startled by me as I was by them. I'll never know. What I do know is that I learned to trust my gut and to always let someone know where I'd be spending the night from then on. The wilderness can be a place of peace and solitude, but it can also be a place where your mind plays tricks on you. And sometimes, those tricks can feel very, very real. 14 years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to spend a weekend camping in the woods near Ithaca, upstate New York. We found a nice spot to set up our tent, had a quick meal, and decided to go for a short hike before it got too dark. The woods were dense but peaceful, the kind of quiet that's almost heavy, where you can hear your own breathing. The sun was setting, and we found a hill with a sharp drop-off that seemed perfect to sit on while we shared a joint and watched the sky change colors. As we sat there, it was just us, the woods, and the slowly darkening sky. The tranquility was almost surreal, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call breaking the silence. We were relaxed, letting our minds wander as the last light of day faded. The darkness crept in quicker than we expected, but we weren't concerned. We knew our way back to camp, and there was something comforting about the familiarity of the woods around us. The conversation slowed as we sat in companionable silence, just soaking in the quiet. But then, out of nowhere, we heard something. It started as a faint noise off to our left, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. It was the sound of something big, something heavy, barreling through the underbrush, heading straight for us. There was no time to react, no time to even process what was happening. Suddenly, a deer exploded from the trees, its body just a blur in the dim light as it leaped over us. It was so close that I could feel the rush of air as it passed overhead, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, continuing its mad dash down the hill and disappearing into the darkness below. We sat there, completely stunned, trying to wrap our heads around what had just happened. My heart was pounding, the adrenaline from the shock making everything feel surreal. It took a few moments to realize that we were okay, that nothing had happened to us. We just got spooked by a deer. Eventually, the initial shock wore off, and we started to laugh. It was the kind of laughter that comes when you realize how ridiculous a situation was in hindsight, but at that moment, it had felt genuinely terrifying. We eventually made our way back to camp, the eerie calm of the woods returning as if nothing had happened. The night passed without further incident, and by the next morning, the fear had faded into something to joke about over breakfast. Even now, I look back on that night and laugh, grateful that being scared by a deer remains the most terrifying experience I've had in the backcountry. But I'll never forget the way it felt in those few seconds when everything seemed to go silent before that deer appeared, the sheer rush of fear and then the absurdity of it all. It's a story I'm happy to tell, knowing that the woods held nothing more sinister that night than a startled animal just trying to find its way. I was camped at the base of a mountain, deep in the wilderness, miles away from any other person. The sky was clear, and I'd stayed up late to take some pictures of the stars. It was around 1 in the morning, the kind of late night where the world feels completely still, with nothing but the sound of my own breath and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. I had just adjusted my camera when I noticed a light flickering on the mountainside. It was about halfway up, in a spot that didn't seem right. I watched it for a moment, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The light moved back and forth, panning across the face of the mountain, slowly and methodically. My first thought was that maybe someone was up there, trying to signal for help. But as I stared, unease began to settle in. The light wasn't anywhere near the established climbing routes, and I knew that section of the mountain was dangerous, filled with loose rock and steep ice. It wasn't a place anyone should be, especially at that time of night. I considered my options. I wasn't equipped for glacier travel, and the idea of trying to reach the light in the middle of the night was out of the question. I didn't have cell reception, and I was at least 2 days away from any help. The more I thought about it, the more helpless I felt. There was nothing I could do but watch that light sway back and forth. I kept an eye on it for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light blinked out, leaving the mountainside dark once more. The stillness that followed was almost suffocating. I stood there, staring at the spot where the light had been, my mind racing with possibilities. Had something gone terribly wrong up there? Was someone trapped, injured, or worse? The fact that I would likely never know what had happened weighed heavily on me. There was nothing more I could do that night, so I forced myself to get some sleep, though it didn't come easily. The next morning, as I packed up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I found a group of climbers and told them what I'd seen, describing the approximate location of the light. They listened, nodded, and agreed to keep an eye out as they made their way up the mountain. As soon as I got back to my car, I called search and rescue, reporting what I'd seen and where. They took down the information and assured me they'd investigate, but I never found out if they did, or if anyone was found. To this day, I still think about that light. Whether it was a climber in distress, some trick of the eye, or something else entirely, I'll never know. But that moment, standing in the cold night, staring up at a light that shouldn't have been there, is one I'll never forget. The uncertainty haunts me, leaving me to wonder if I witnessed the last desperate act of someone lost in the mountains, or if it was just a reminder of how truly alone we can be out there.